4 years ago, America's alliances were in tatters, especially in the Indo-Pacific. We saw a retreat from support for democracy and human rights, a chaotic patchwork of diplomatic grudges and self-defeating trade policies, and demands that our allies pay the cost of hosting U.S. bases. China was filling the vacuum left by the United States' approach to foreign policy that some called America first, but was in reality America alone. Only 4 years later, our alliances have never been stronger. The tremendous progress is thanks to the hard work of the Biden administration. The historic Camp David summit with Japan and South Korea, the August agreement with Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, which goes far beyond nuclear submarines, the increased practical cooperation with members of the Quad, Australia, Japan, and India, who share many of our strategic views on China. And just last week, we witnessed the first ever trilateral summit here in Washington between Japan, the Philippines, and the United States. Our alliances in the region don't just reassure nations who live in Beijing's shadows, they also pay off for the American people. Whether it's intelligence sharing on mutual threats or U.S. basing and rotational agreements, we enjoy an enormous benefit from maintaining our Indo-Pacific alliances. Both Democrats and Republicans understand how important this region is. That is why there's bipartisan agreement across Congress on the need to preserve and deepen these alliances. And I'm optimistic that the House will do the right thing and pass the administration's supplemental security package. It not only includes vital funding for Ukraine, but almost $5 billion for the Indo-Pacific. As President Kennedy once said, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. Those whom nature hath so joined together, let no man put asunder. The truth is that one of the United States' greatest strategic advantages are our alliances. Who are China's closest friends? Russia, Iran, North Korea. Some of the worst human rights abusers in the world that repress the hope and dreams of their citizens. Meanwhile, we have 5 mutual defense treaties with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and Thailand. And our partnerships include New Zealand, Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, Mongolia, and Taiwan, and the list goes on. No one wants to be left off. Why? It's not just because we have the greatest military in the world, it's because of our values. It's because while others might use debt-trap diplomacy to buy influence, the United States is working to bring peace and stability and prosperity. It's because we're working to uphold the rules-based international order that has benefited people across the planet. We cannot go back to the days when America was agonizing and even attacking our friends. We cannot succeed with a foreign policy that tells dictators to do whatever the hell they want to our allies. From manufacturing microchips to expanding the operational reach of our military across the Pacific, to combating corruption, to standing up for human rights, the stakes in the Indo-Pacific are simply too high for the United States. We need a robust economic agenda, and we need to show up with concrete alternatives to what our competitors are offering in infrastructure and investment. America's leadership in the world has never been more important. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. We have 2 very, very distinguished expert witnesses with us today, and we should have an incredibly important discussion. But first, let me recognize the distinguished ranking member, Senator Risch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me say that the United States has had a strategic interest in Asia, being open and free for over 2 centuries. We opened a consulate in India in 1792. In the 1850s, various U.S. senators made speeches about thwarting efforts by various colonial powers to dominate the region. A balance of power favorable to the United States protects U.S. interests and ally sovereignty, advances economic prosperity, and ensures no one has to bow to a bully. However, this balance is being challenged. The greatest threat of regional domination, of course, comes from China, supported by a growing China-Russia strategic partnership. It has been interesting to watch Russia become the junior partner in this relationship. China has improved its strategic posture by creating trade and economic dependencies and seizing territory from the South China Sea to the Indian border. China knows it can get what it wants if it proves U.S. alliances and partnerships are not up to the task when things get tough. Time and again, we've played into their hands. In 2012, the United States stood by as China seized the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines uncontested, a failure we must not forget or repeat, given China's growing encroachment on more territory like the Second Thomas Shoal. Weak responses spread the idea that we are unreliable. Left unanswered, our allies' confidence is shaken, and we should not be surprised if they seek to engage with China to protect their own national interests. Even in the face of a deteriorating strategic position, we remain unserious about ensuring our alliances can address our shared objectives and contend with shared threats. U.S. allies plead for deeper economic engagement with us, yet the U.S. does not have a substantive economic agenda. The administration's Indo-Pacific economic framework sounds good, but delivers nothing. While there are calls for reviews of foreign investments by allies in the United States, we at the same time allow Chinese firms to benefit from U.S. tax credits and to profit off research at U.S. universities. This approach should be reversed. Meanwhile, the administration's approach to allies puts ideology ahead of reality. The last three budgets proposed by the administration prioritize gender and climate over countering China's advantages in transportation and digital infrastructure. The administration instructs allies to stop buying Russian energy and then, at the same time, bans U.S. LNG exports. This ham-handed move has not gone unnoticed by our allies, and for obvious reasons is roundly criticized. Numerous political declarations and joint statements obscure the lack of substance and progress with our allies. AUKUS is the most egregious example. I strongly support AUKUS, but the administration announced the security alliance in 2021, but did not negotiate what it meant until after the press release went out. It is now 2024, and we still don't know when any new military capabilities will be produced. To make it worse, the administration refuses to certify that Australia and UK, our closest allies, have the laws to adequately support defense cooperation. But this didn't stop the administration from announcing moves to add a new AUKUS partner last week. Similarly, the administration announced with great fanfare a nuclear consultative group with South Korea to deter North Korean aggression. A great idea. A year later, where's the progress? Further, the administration fails to prioritize greater burden sharing. The demands of this security environment are immense. Our partners need to step up and buy more capability and conduct more presence operations. Finally, the administration's Indo-Pacific alliance strategy does not account for the growing China-Russia alignment. Our Asian partners recognize that what happens in Ukraine will affect Asia's future. The administration is politely asking China to restrain Russia rather than imposing effective, strong economic punishment on China for its active role in Ukraine's suffering. That's the only kind of thing that China will understand or respond to. The administration's approach to alliances is not serving our interests. Protectionism over economic engagement, ideology over pragmatism, and form over substance do not advance U.S. interests or give our Indo-Pacific partners strategic options. Initiatives must have concrete actions if they are to help us win this competition. The administration's performance is underwhelming. I look forward to hearing the witnesses' thoughts on these matters. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Risch. I think we all agree that the Indo-Pacific is critically important to U.S. national security interests. So the topic of modernizing the U.S. alliances and partnership in the Indo-Pacific is a timely subject. We have two outstanding experts on this subject that have joined us today, and I want to thank both of you for your service and for your being here today. First, we have today Admiral Harry Harris, a decorated four-star admiral who served our country for 3 years as the 24th Commander of U.S. Pacific Command, Indo-PACOM. Admiral Harris more recently led U.S. bilateral relations with our friends in Seoul as the U.S. Ambassador to South Korea from 2018 to 2021. Admiral Harris, it would be difficult to find anyone with more experience than you, have both in the military and diplomatic capacities in the Indo-Pacific. You're a strong advocate for the U.S. alliances and realistic regarding the seriousness of our competition with the PRC. Our second witness is Professor Walter Russell Mead, an accomplished academic and historian, currently serving as the Distinguished Fellow in Strategies and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute. Professor Mead is also the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College and currently contributes to the Wall Street Journal and its Global View columnist. So we have two very, very accomplished experts. Your entire statements will be made part of the record. You may proceed as you wish. We hope that you can summarize in about 5 minutes or so we have time for committee discussion. With that, let me start with Admiral Harris.
Thanks, Chairman Cardin and Ranking Member Risch and distinguished members. It's an honor for me to appear again before this committee. It's been almost 6 years since I last appeared here for my confirmation hearing to be the ambassador to South Korea. I thought then that would be my last testimony before you. I thought wrong. Today I'm honored and even intimidated to testify alongside the esteemed, dare I say, revered Professor Walter Russell Mead, a distinguished strategist, historian, teacher, and prolific writer who understands well the challenges and threats that confront America in the 21st century. So please throw the hard balls at him and toss the softballs to me. I know I'm time limited here, so let me get right to it by first thanking this committee. That this hearing to examine the issue of U.S. alliances and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific comes immediately after Japanese Prime Minister Kishida's and Philippine President Marcos's visit, and 2 weeks after we celebrated NATO's 75th anniversary, sends a powerful signal to the world in general and to our adversaries in particular. This committee's introduction last week of a bipartisan resolution underscoring the strength and the importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance serves as an authoritative reminder that 2024 marks 64 years of our formal alliance with Japan. Importantly, this month also celebrates and marks the 45th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act. In my opinion, without Congress's active intervention back in 1979, when your predecessors in the 96th Congress crafted the act, Taiwan would have long succumbed to the People's Republic of China, or PRC. Today, 45 years later, Taiwan is democratic, an idea factory, and a global force for good, despite the PRC's unrelenting quest to intimidate, isolate, and finally dominate this beleaguered island. The Cato Institute's 2023 Freedom Index ranked Taiwan as the freest country in Asia. As reference points, Taiwan ranked higher than Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, and even us. The PRC ranked a dismal 149 out of 165 countries. Unlike our policy of strategic ambiguity, the PRC's intent is crystal clear. We must never allow the PRC to dictate America's Taiwan policy. As this committee knows far better than me, there are very few bipartisan issues in Washington these days, but our national concern about the PRC is one of them. Now, I visited Taiwan 3 times last year. In my opinion, Russia on Ukraine has galvanized them. They get it, but they need our tangible support, not our best wishes. And I'm happy to discuss how this could happen in the Q&A session. Throughout my long military career and my short stint in diplomacy, I emphasize my belief that America's single greatest asymmetric strength is our network of alliances and partnerships. Today, we face a security environment more complex and volatile than any I've experienced ever. Today, more than ever, alliances are critical to our national security. Alliances and allies matter. Ambassador Emanuel, our envoy to Japan, put it just this way last Sunday. We're betting on our allies, and they're betting on us. President Reagan once said that we cannot play innocence abroad in a world that's not innocent. This statement is as true today as it was on December 7th, throughout the Cold War, on 9/11, on 2/24, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and on the 7th of October, when Hamas terrorists invaded Israel. Over 1,000 Israelis, including women, children, and the elderly, were subjected to unspeakable cruelty, murder, and rape, and hundreds were taken hostage. This is pure evil, and it baffles me and angers me that there are those who seek to justify Hamas's actions. Indeed, the world remains a dangerous place. The unipolar moment following the Cold War is long over. So today, more than ever, I believe that America's security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific are inextricably linked to this network of alliances and partnerships as we face a challenging and precarious crossroad where tangible opportunity meets significant challenge. We find ourselves again in peer competition, not near peer, but peer competition with adversaries who are developing and deploying cutting-edge weaponry and information disorder to undermine democracy and defeat us. An aggressive North Korea is building and testing nuclear weapons. A revisionist PRC seeks regional, then global domination. And a revanchist Russia is on the move in Europe. I agree with Professor Mead's piece in the Wall Street Journal where he opined that we get it wrong when we believe that giving in to leaders like Putin will satisfy them. In my opinion, the same can be said of Kim Jong-un and autocrats the world over. Equally concerning to me is the dangerous and growing alignment between the PRC, Russia, and North Korea, and all three with Iran. Maya Angelou once said that when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. These autocrats have shown us who they are time and time again and what they intend to do, and shame on us if we ignore them. Professor Mead asserted over a decade ago that America's Cold War alliances were insufficient then to meet the needs of the 21st century. I agree. So today, in addition to the U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral, we have the Quad, we have AUKUS, and the new trilateral relationship involving the Philippines. In my written statement, I talk about specific alliances and multilateral relationships, so I won't go into them here other than to observe that, one, AUKUS is not an alliance to counter an alien invasion, and two, those relationships reflect a fundamental change to America's approach. Moving away from the old hub-and-spoke model of my day, so 20th century, Indo-PACOM is now pursuing lattice-like security arrangements with multiple connections between members. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll conclude my remarks with this observation. The U.S. made two flawed geopolitical assumptions last century. One, we assumed that the PRC would morph into something resembling a global force for good, and two, that Russia would no longer threaten its neighbors or the West. Today, the Russian bear is afoot, and we find ourselves shooting well behind the Peking duck. We must step up our game, or we'll find ourselves outgunned, literally and figuratively. While challenges to our interests in the Indo-Pacific are real and daunting, I believe our resolve is powerful and durable. And while we are bolstered, sustained, and strengthened by our allies and partners. Again, to quote Professor Mead, a distracted America still leads the world. I thank this committee and the Congress for your enduring support of our diplomatic corps and our armed forces, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Admiral Harris, first of all, I very much appreciate your testimony. It's very informative, very helpful, and very different than when you testified before us on your nomination. So we could see the difference between those types of appearances, but again, thank you for your service. Professor Mead.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Risch, distinguished members of this committee, it's a great honor to be asked to speak before you and especially to testify with either Admiral or Ambassador Harris in both capacities. He is one of America's great public servants. I'll just make 5 points this morning, and I hope they will contribute to our discussion. First, America's interests are global, but our goal is not global conquest. History teaches that if any country dominates either Europe or Asia, our security and our prosperity here will come under attack. Maintaining this balance of power and ensuring the freedom of the world's sea lanes and communications networks is now and has been for many generations the foundation of American foreign policy. These limited goals make American power a force for the freedom of other countries and provide the basis for strong and enduring partnerships. Our goal should be to safeguard these vital long-term national interests at the lowest possible risk and cost. Second, allies are a vital asset. We do not want to fight either Russia or China, or for that matter, Iran, on our own. Fortunately, when great powers try to dominate their neighborhoods, the smaller powers come looking for allies. Today, countries like India, Japan, and, thanks in part to Ambassador Harris's service, South Korea, have awakened to the danger. Sweden and Finland have joined NATO to help check Russia's bid for power. And we all saw literally a miracle last week as Arab air forces joined with the UK, the US, and Israel to block Iran's missile and drone attacks. Third, after the Cold War, Americans fell asleep at the wheel. We took our military and economic superiority for granted and thought that the era of great power competition was over. We ignored the danger signs from Russia and Iran. We failed to foresee the consequences of China's abuse of the world trading system or to match its military buildup in its neighborhood. Today, we and our allies are overstretched and under attack. Wars are erupting all over the world. We must get back to the basics. Military power is not the only dimension of American power, but without a solid hard power foundation, we will not be able to make progress on issues like human rights or climate change. Fourth, we now face an axis of revisionist powers, including China, Russia, Iran, and smaller hostile countries around the world. These countries do not love or trust each other, but their fear and hatred of American power and their hope that we can now at long last be defeated is once again haunting the civilized world and driving them to act in concert. The danger of a downward spiral into a new era of chaos and war is real. We can look at Gaza and Sudan to see what an era like that will mean for the peoples of the world. Fifth and finally, we still have time to turn things around. We are not yet in the position of Winston Churchill, who could promise his fellow citizens nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat in the darkest days of World War II. We can still deter war while working for peace. China can be deterred from attacking its neighbors while those neighbors catch up with its economic growth and military might. Russia, Iran, and the fanatical terrorists seeking to revive the ideology of jihadism can be taught that their fantasies of empire cannot be fulfilled. While he was still in college, the young John Fitzgerald Kennedy wrote his senior thesis about Britain's failure to foresee and forestall the terrible tragedy of World War II. Soon after, he published his thesis as the book, Why England Slept. After that, he went to war. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Risch, honorable members, I pray to God that no young Americans today will have to write a book about why America slept or to fight in the war that will come if we fail. This distinguished committee does not need for me to tell it that the world situation is dark today and getting darker. But with focus, determination, and the help of our allies, we can still turn this around. And this famous committee, scene of so many of the great debates that shaped American and world history in past generations, can, and I very much hope will, play a leading role in helping to put the world back on the path to peace. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your insight. I think we all need to take your advice and be prepared to act on it. I was interested in both of your comments about our alliances, which is the subject here for the Indo-Pacific. I would agree with you, Professor Mead, that our adversaries don't trust each other, but they have an alliance. Their alliance is not a transparent alliance that we do when we deal with the Quad or we deal with the August agreements. But there's a clear alliance between China, between Russia, between Iran, between North Korea. They are covering for each other and supporting each other. They may not trust each other. And they are forming a very strong bloc against the interests of national security interests of the United States to promote value-based, rule-based global systems with democratic institutions. So I guess my first question is, we have a lot of alliances. America is known in Indo-Pacific for being military forward, but are we doing enough in trade and investment and diplomacy, which is really where I think the battleground needs to be? Our military is there, absolutely important, but we need to avoid, as you said, sending our men and women over in harm's way. So is there a better way to coordinate our alliances in order to meet the challenges that we have today? Let me start, if I might, first with Professor Mead, and then we'll go to Admiral Ambassador Harris.
Well, absolutely, Senator. You know, in 1980, India's GDP was 65% of China's. Today, it's about 17% of China's. And that gap that opened up is in some ways the heart of our problem in the Far East. That is to say that China, which at one point was one of a number of powers in Asia, has, thanks to its vast economic growth and its military buildup, become a threat to the system. The best way to assure the long-term stability of the Indo-Pacific, of a free and open Indo-Pacific, without Americans going to war, is to encourage and support the economic growth of countries like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, in the hope that at some point, as these countries are more dynamic, powerful, and wealthy, even in Beijing, they'll understand that their dream of dominating the Indo-Pacific is simply not realistic. It's too big for any one country, even China, to control. And so this must always be a core element of our strategy in the region.
Admiral Harris, you were our military leader in the Indo-Pacific, and then you became our ambassador to one of the most important countries in the region. So are we putting too much attention into the military and not into diplomacy and economics and trade?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think so. I think that we are putting adequate emphasis on diplomacy, the military component, and the economic component. However, I'm not convinced that we're advocating all the time for the right things in those three buckets. Let me get at it just a little bit. I'll add to what Professor Mead said by highlighting that in 1970, the GDP of South Korea was actually less than that of North Korea. And by some measure, South Korea is the 9th largest economy in the world today. And that's not because of the great communist system that North Korea has. It's because South Korea was provided an umbrella under which it could develop economically, and that umbrella was provided by us. So I think that's an important point.
Let me fine-tune this a little bit. We withdrew from TPP. This framework that is being discussed is important, but it's not trade agreements. It doesn't have remedies. We are not a member of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Are we missing opportunities because we're not as aggressive as we need to be on those fronts?
Clearly, in my opinion, we are missing huge opportunities. So I advocated in uniform for the United States to become a signatory to TPP, which is kind of an unusual position for a military officer to take, but I did it because of the security relationships between the TPP countries that I felt would have been strengthened had we become a signatory to it. We lost that opportunity, and now there's this thing called CPTPP, which is being driven by Japan, and we're not a signatory to that. We might end up, or not we, it might end up super ironic that China becomes a signatory, a member of CPTPP, which is a free trade agreement. I agree with the ranking member that IPEF lacks the teeth that a free trade agreement or free trade relationship gives. So I'm an advocate for free trade agreements. I believe we need to have a free trade agreement with Taiwan. Different issue, but I think we should have one with Taiwan. And I hope that we become a signatory to CPTPP, not for the benefit of the other 12 countries that are in, or 11 countries that are in CPTPP, but because of us. For our own enlightened self-interest, we should become a signatory to these things. And the same with UNCLOS. That's the United Nations Commission on Law of the Sea. We have long been a holdout in signing onto UNCLOS, even though it was President Reagan who actually, and his team, who put together the final package for UNCLOS. He had a lot of disagreements with the UNCLOS as it was initially crafted, and for all the right reasons. So he and his team crafted a version of UNCLOS that would have benefited the United States economically. But here we are today as one of the few countries in the world that are not signatories to UNCLOS. In fact, if you look at the globe of nations that are not signatories to UNCLOS, it starts to resemble an axis of stupidity because we're not signatories to this thing that China, Russia, and others are signatories to, and they are taking economic advantage of all the things that UNCLOS provides, and we are not. So that is, in my opinion, shooting ourselves in the foot.
Thank you. Senator Risch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm tempted to take up there, but I got a couple of things I want to talk about first. You know, we're almost a fourth of the way through the 21st century already, and as we've watched this first quarter of a century unfold, it's become apparent, I think, that more and more we're seeing two poles develop, and that one pole is the association of the autocracies in the world, and the other is the democracies of the world. And as every year goes by, it seems it gets more and more so. Our affiliation for the people on our side is our values, our freedoms, the things that we value. On the other side, I think that they're pulled together, as you guys have pointed out, a hatred for America, amongst other things, but also their values of how they think a government should treat their people. I think the challenge for the rest of the 21st century is how the two poles keep from killing each other and exist on the same planet, because they're not going to change. The autocracies aren't going to change. I mean, there's hope, I think, for Iran because of the demographics in the country, but China's not going to change. Russia's not going to change. North Korea's not going to change. So we've got to figure out how we do that. Your thoughts on how we coexist with these countries? We're certainly not changing. They're not certainly changing. Mr. Mead, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think here we come back to some degree to the thought of George Kennan and thinking about how are we going to deal with the Soviet Union after World War II, a hostile power with expansionist ambitions, morbid suspicion of the United States, a non-transparent political system, and yet in a world of nuclear weapons, the idea of a U.S.-Soviet war was unthinkable. And his analysis, I think, remains useful today, that you can reach agreements, pragmatic agreements with powers like this under some circumstances, but you first have to establish a firm line of deterrence. They have to realize that sort of pushing and poking with a bayonet won't get them any benefits, that your power and your resolve and your alliance network are resilient and strong enough so that they cannot succeed in this other way. And then you can start to talk about areas where you do have real interest. We got through 40 years of the Cold War in this way, not always elegantly, but I think we're going to find that, yes, learning to live with countries with whom we have fundamental differences is going to be, at least in the kind of year-to-year process necessary to our policy. We can hope for better things. We can, as you mentioned with Iran, my own experiences of traveling in China before Xi Jinping took things in a different direction was that there are many, many people in China who see the world much more the way we do than the way the current leadership of the Chinese Communist Party does. I am not given to despair. But I think pragmatically, we cannot assume that our enemies will suddenly convert to the cause of democracy and human rights, and all of our problems will melt away. We need another, more substantive strategy for dealing with it.
Ambassador.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Senator. I think we have an exemplar to look at, and that's the long Cold War against the Soviet Union. Both hugely capable nuclear states that managed to work through the daily differences without treading on the foundational differences between our countries until the Soviet Union collapsed of its own weight. I think it's important that we understand that we are at a fundamentally, ideologically polar opposite of the positions that are taken today by the modern China, Russia, North Korea, and even Iran. And we ought not to begin discussions with these countries, in my opinion, trying to negotiate away those foundational beliefs that they hold, just as they shouldn't try to negotiate away our foundational beliefs. And an example of that is the Taiwan issue. China is not going to change their mind that Taiwan is a renegade province of China. And we shouldn't try to change that view of theirs because it's a waste of breath, energy, and resources. And they shouldn't try to change our idea that we think that the Taiwan issue should be resolved peacefully by the Taiwanese. Now, if we yield to that point in any way, then they're winning and we're losing. I think that we ought to keep this in mind as we make policies at the political level and laws at the congressional level when we deal with these countries. And some examples of this is the Science and Chips Act. Another example is the Congress's, the Senate's actual examination of TikTok and these sorts of things. You know, that falls into the realm of policy and laws.
Yeah. Thank you. My time's up, but I wish we had more time to this. Your comments have been fascinating and certainly open a lot more areas of discussion, but here's what it is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you to our two distinguished witnesses. I'm grateful that you're offering us your insight and your advice in this important time. In your opening testimony, Mr. Meade, you sounded a dark but important and I think timely note by referencing back to John F. Kennedy's book, Why America Slept, and then the consequences that he himself was in combat in the South Pacific a few short years later. Given what both of you have seen, studied, spoken about, I do think it is long past time for us to be more engaged, effective, and purposeful in meeting this moment. And this is timely because right now, today, on the other side of the Congress, the Speaker is making a decision. His caucus is making a decision about whether we will move ahead with robust funding for security in the Indo-Pacific, for the defense of Israel, for the defense of Ukraine, for humanitarian aid, that in combination will reassure a divided and worried world that the United States intends to still be the indispensable global partner with this network of alliances, this lattice of security arrangements we have. I thought it was a striking development in the last year that both Germany and Japan decided to double their defense spending. In both cases, it has a double-edged sword. It's partly because they lack confidence that we will be the trusted and reliable security partner they have counted on us to be for decades. It's also because, as Prime Minister Kishida said to us in an address to a joint session of Congress, that they recognize that Americans have wearied of bearing so much of the burden of being that guarantor of the free and open global system. We have critical work to do, and I think in the last 3 years there's been real progress. AUKUS was a striking innovation in terms of security and deterrence. The Quad has been elevated from a talk shop to a real movement forward. And as you both said in your testimony, our alliances are our absolutely key strategic benefit. Tragically, our past president, unmoored from a sense of history, did not appreciate or invest in those alliances. Many have invested and worked hard, both of you, and you in particular, as ambassador, helped bring together Japan and Korea in a way that critically contributes to the regional security architecture. You've referenced some critical failings, the failure to ratify the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which those of us who serve on this committee, we were here for those debates. I only wish we could go back and rerun them and ratify them again. The failure to join CPTPP and to have a real and robust trade and economic agenda. What are the key actions now, looking forward, that each of you would urge us to take, both to strengthen our security architecture in the region to deter the dark possibilities, Mr. Meade, that you laid out, and to better balance what I think is our real strength, which is our economy? We are the world's most innovative country. We have the strongest economic underpinnings of any advanced society right now. Our biggest weakness is our political division, is our inability to show that confidence, that bipartisan strength that this committee was long known for. What are the key actions you think we must take in this moment to secure our future? Mr. Meade, and then if I might, Admiral.
Well, thank you, Senator Coons. Those very useful questions. I hope my answers will be as useful as the question. To give you just two quick things, I would say that we do need to increase our defense spending in ways that are not simply spreading pork around the American economy, but actually focused on the capabilities that we need and that our allies are looking for. If Germany and Japan can do a better job, so can we. Domestically, though, and I think this is important, I agree with you with all we've been hearing this morning about the need for U.S. receptivity to more trade, fair and free trade agreements with key partners. To do that, we need to be reassuring the American people that our economy is moving forward in a way that benefits them. I'm actually publishing today or tomorrow, depending on it, an essay in Tablet magazine that looks at how we can use some technological innovations to help Gen Z, the Zoomers, enjoy the same kind of access to single-family housing and get on the property ladder in the way that past generations have done. I think when the American people see that the door is open to more prosperity for them, we as a country will be able to approach some of these international issues in a more open-minded and I think ultimately helpful way.
Mr. Chairman, if we might, could we hear from the ambassador?
Thanks, Senator. I think there are a half dozen ways I can respond to your question. I'll start by saying that we should be real aggressive, in my opinion, on laws that affect our relationship with China. Aggressive in terms of holding China accountable and then protecting our country. Again, I go back to the CHIPS and Science Act. I look at what could come down the pike with TikTok and the like. I think that we should sign on to CPTPP before China does. We will be at a significant economic disadvantage if China gets into CPTPP and we do not. We should sign on clause for all the reasons that I talked about. I think we should reimagine foreign military sales, FMS, and a couple examples here. We should get the munitions to Taiwan that Taiwan has already paid for, that Congress has already authorized, and we still have not gotten those munitions, those weapon systems to Taiwan. It has taken us 8 years to get Harpoon to Taiwan, even though Taiwan has Harpoon, and that sale has already been approved. So it should not take 8 years. It should not take a decade to do that. I think we should increase our defense spending. If you look at it in terms of inflation, our defense spending has actually gone down at a time when we need it more than ever. I think we should look for ways to use foreign weapons manufacturers, shipbuilding, for example, as a bridge to overcome our own industrial deficiencies in this regard in the 2020 timeframe. Not as a permanent solution, but as a bridge solution. Those are just some ideas. I'll stop here.
Thank you both. Mr. Chairman, I could not agree more with the testimony that the hour is late, the need is urgent, and we need to act in a way that shows the bipartisan determination to address things like defense modernization, using trade, and engaging more closely with our allies. Thank you for this hearing.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. China apparently believes that America is in decline, that our social networks are frayed, that our industrial base is not as strong as it once was, that actually there are attitudes of isolationism in the U.S. and unwillingness to work with allies and to support allies. Given the fact that Xi is reported to be a pretty smart guy, wouldn't he be wise to say, if that's the case, why don't we just wait out Taiwan, wait out America's weakness, and no reason to invade? I know there are many who feel like invasion could be imminent, but if he really believed that America was in decline, a position I disagree with, but if he were to believe that and also recognize that an invasion of Taiwan would have an enormous economic impact on China, given their reliance on Taiwanese semiconductors, is it your view that that invasion is a real and imminent threat, or is it that no, actually, Xi Jinping is going to wait it out and see how things develop? And we'll each of you get a chance to speak. Mr. Mood, could you begin, and then we'll turn to the Admiral.
Yes, Senator, thank you for the question. Well, I'm not good at reading anyone's mind, and Xi Jinping is not transparent to me. But I do think that what we need to do, the best way to restore predictability and stability, and in fact to get the topic of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan off the sort of international conversation agenda, is for there to be a margin of military superiority sufficient so that it is evident to people in Beijing as well as elsewhere that it's simply not possible for China to successfully attack. And those are not preparations for invasion of the mainland by us. These are defensive preparations. Yeah. And in that case, China itself will stop talking about Taiwan, stop harassing Taiwan as much, because why do you open a conversation the result of which will simply advertise your weakness? Yeah, yeah. So this would be the way I think we should proceed.
Thank you. Admiral?
Senator, I think on the one hand, if you look at it, demographically, the PRC is upside down in terms of youth and age and the like. So that could argue that sooner rather than later regarding an invasion. But on the other hand, I think that Xi Jinping is no fool. He seeks stability in the international order so that he has time to shape that international order even more to his favor. So that would argue against the likelihood of an immediate attack on Taiwan. You know, I'm reminded, because of my former jobs, of the Davidson window. Phil Davidson was the four-star that relieved me at Indo-Pacific when I retired, and he famously said, or the Davidson window famously ascribes to him 2027 as a time frame by which China could and will invade Taiwan. I've never put a time certain on that. Minahan, General Minahan, who's the Air Force four-star, he said 2025. Well, that's next year. And Davidson window is 2027. I always said that the 2030s was the decade of danger. So I think we're moving in that direction, and we could move to the point that Xi Jinping will balance all the pluses and minuses and could decide, because of the reasons that you articulated and because of the demographic upside-down status of his people, that might be the time to attack Taiwan. So we have time, I believe, Senator, to right that issue by supporting Taiwan and doing the other things I talked about in response to Senator Coons' questions.
Thank you. Let me ask, should or are Japan and South Korea thinking about becoming nuclear nations? They're next door to people, North Korea and China, that have nuclear weapons. They look at us as being their source of nuclear protection. But if are they thinking about becoming nuclear, or should they be? And Mr. Meade and Admiral.
Yeah, so I'll start with that,
Yeah.
Senator. There are clearly elements inside South Korea and inside Japan that are advocating for their own independent nuclear deterrent. Those voices so far have not been the predominant voices in either country, which is a good thing. There are some in Korea that are advocating for the return of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, which we removed in the 1990s. I believe that both are bad ideas, that we have to convince them that our extended nuclear deterrence is actually reliable and real. And I think South Korea's President Yoon's visit to the U.S. last year, the outcome of which was the Washington Declaration on Extended Nuclear Deterrence, has gone a long way to quieting those voices that would have South Korea nuclearized, if you will.
Mr. Meade, do you have comments on that? May I continue? Thank you.
I believe that I would hope that we will not see that day, because that day would be an indication that both of those countries no longer trusted the United States' ability to take the lead there. But I think also we would then see this as the beginning of a further proliferation cascade. What begins in East Asia would not stop in East Asia, and personally I believe the world has too many nuclear weapons already.
Thank you.
Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and thank you to our two distinguished testifiers. Admiral Harris, it's very good to see you again.
Sir.
It's been too long. It is well known that Hawaii is not covered by Article 6 of the NATO treaty. In fact, I have, with the permission of the chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from Senator Inouye to Assistant Secretary MacArthur in 1965 on this very topic.
Without objection.
Admiral Harris, do you think there is deterrent value in making it explicit that Hawaii is covered?
Yeah, Senator, good to see you again, and for sure. So the issue, for those who might not be aware of it, is Article 6 defines the geographic area of NATO. Hawaii is not in the geographic area as defined by Article 6. As Article 6 was amended to include Alaska, Alaska is. And also, Hawaii became a state after the Atlantic Charter was signed. I believe that Hawaii in 2024 is far different than Hawaii in 1965. And Hawaii is on the front line of any attack if we were to suffer an attack from China or North Korea. It is on the front line. It will be attacked again. And I don't want to be a part of another December 7th if we can prevent it. Hawaii and NATO, in my opinion, will go a long way to preventing that. It would, in fact, be a deterrent. Now, Hawaii is in 2024 is a state. Hawaii is far different than other countries who have territories globally, those territories of which may not be covered by NATO. Hawaii is a state. Its congressional leaders vote on things like the United Nations, on things like Ukraine, on issues like impeachment, and all of that. Unlike perhaps other territories of the United States. So I think that Hawaii's status is different than that of other territories. And therefore I believe that Hawaii should be covered by NATO. Now the argument against it is, well, all these other countries have territories too. Again, Hawaii is not like these other territories.
Well, we're not a territory, and thank you, Admiral Harris, for that. And the other argument that I've heard is that we would be covered by Article 4, but Article 4 is just provides for consultation. And so the argument from NATO, and for those that don't want to go through the difficulty of amending this agreement or even establishing a sidecar explicit multilateral agreement, is that, well, if Hawaii were attacked, and I think this is true, by the way, that certainly we would convene NATO, and then we would, under Article 4, consult. That's cold comfort, isn't it? And I think that for our national security and also as a matter of principle to treat every one of our 50 states equally, that we have to remedy this. And the argument is also made that various NATO countries have territories all across the globe. Territories, not states. That is a different question, and I think it's one that we have to address. My final question for you, Admiral Harris, is just over the last several years, my own judgment is that we, the United States, have done, through the State Department and the Department of Defense, a much better job of engaging with our Asia-Pacific allies in terms of island nations. That when we think about the Indo-Pacific, we usually skip all the way over the Pacific part and then just go to South Asia or East Asia and the sort of trouble areas, right? And one of the things that I think Secretary Blinken and President Biden and Senators Cardin and Risch, through ratifying COFA, through spending time with Pacific Island leaders, have done is to show the respect to other sovereigns. They may be a sovereign with 65,000 residents. They may be a sovereign with 2 million people, but they are still a sovereign country and deserve to be interacted with as if they are not just a place to park our military equipment and to perhaps have a trade agreement. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the evolution of that, those relationships and how that impacts our security.
Yeah, we did ignore these countries in South Pacific and Central Pacific, and it's shameful that we did. China, on the other hand, has not ignored them, and they work hard at filling the diplomatic and economic void left by the United States. An example is, we have an ambassador in Fiji who's the ambassador to 5 different countries. He's spread thin throughout that region, and we're starting to correct it thanks to this committee and the leadership here by putting a standalone and separate ambassador in many of these countries. We pulled out our embassy in the Solomons in the 1990s, and now we're going to put in a new embassy in the Solomons. In the meanwhile, China successfully filled that void from their perspective. So I agree with you, and I'm glad to see that we're starting to fix the situation now.
Thank you very much.
Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Harris, in October at AEI, you assessed that the U.S. is ill-prepared to face off against the PRC in a Taiwan Strait conflict in this decade. You said that our lack of resourcing for the Indo-Pacific, the PRC's upside-down demographics, their own economic challenges, are all factors that could lead the PRC to move sooner rather than later with regard to Taiwan. This makes our alliances and partnerships in the region even more important as they represent a clear and asymmetric advantage that we have over the PRC. The good news is that many of these alliances, from Japan to Australia, have been upgraded in recent years. However, it's still unclear what the role of these allies and partners would play in a Taiwan contingency. For example, Japan is widely seen as, by analysts, as our most likely U.S. ally to contribute troops to defend Taiwan, but of course that's no sure thing. Admiral Harris, if this is indeed the case, where in fact the next decade there's a danger for a Taiwan contingency, what are your expectations in terms of response we could expect from our allies and partners in the region if there were a contingency like this?
Very important question, Senator. I believe that our allies, as we will in other scenarios, they'll make those decisions that best meet their enlightened self-interest. I do believe that Japan understands the full danger presented to them geopolitically by the People's Republic of China. And I think they'll be with us in Taiwan. I think Australia will. Peter Dutton, the former Minister of Defense in Australia, he famously said several years ago that, of course, Australia would be with the United States if the U.S. defended Taiwan. But, our own policy on Taiwan is not clear. We have this policy of strategic ambiguity, so we can't even tell the Taiwanese nor the Chinese what we would do if China invaded Taiwan. Meanwhile, China has spent the last, for all of its existence really, but heavily this century in telling us clearly what they intend to do with regard to Taiwan if Taiwan doesn't yield to them and return to the fold, if you will.
So actually, it's an interesting point you bring up there, Admiral, because I think that's part of our strategy is the strategic ambiguity, to not really say for sure what would happen, so that would give the PRC more difficulty in planning against what we might do. It sounds like from your remarks you almost disagree with that strategic ambiguity, or are you suggesting that we'd be more clear about certain things? Help me with...
Yeah, so I have advocated that we should end our policy of strategic ambiguity in favor of strategic clarity. Now look, in my opinion, we owe that to three constituents, to be clear on the issue of what we will do if China attacks Taiwan. We owe it to the Taiwanese, so they can make those decisions as a country to either arm up or capitulate. We owe it to the Chinese because they're going to lose a lot of troops in any battle with the United States, a lot of them. So they ought to know what they're getting into. We were very clear with the Soviet Union, and that's an important thing. But the most important constituent, in my opinion, Senator, is the American people. So they need to know what their sons and daughters are signing up for when they sign onto the U.S. military with regard to the question of Taiwan and whether we're going to fight the Chinese over that. And the American people, parents primarily, and those who signed up, were very clear in our understanding during the Cold War of what could possibly happen if the Soviets moved on the plains of Western Europe and across the Fulda Gap and down the Greenland, Iceland, UK Gap. Yeah. They signed on to that. They knew that. But they're not clear about China. And we owe it to our own people, I believe, to be clear in that regard.
Yeah, very good. Just getting back to our allies, do you think that their response would be different depending on what the contingency was? You know, for example, if this was a blockade versus an outright military invasion, do you think our allies would behave differently with regard to their level of support for what we're trying to do?
Potentially, but you know, but our allies are wondering what we would do if in any of those scenarios, whether it was an outright invasion or a blockade. And we got to see a precursor of how a blockade might look after former Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, which is very helpful to us to understand how China might react.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm guessing you're saying we should come up with our own direction for those different contingencies, whether it's blockade or outright invasion, and the strategic ambiguity, and just say, hey, this is what we are going to do.
Well, I'll modify that slightly. I mean, I know that Indo-PACOM has those contingencies in planning, but I don't think we should necessarily share what those contingencies are.
Okay, but just the general direction of what our level of support is going to be for Taiwan, should the PRC do something like that?
I think we should defend Taiwan.
Yeah, okay, very good.
I think we should follow the law, which is the Taiwan Relations Act, which doesn't oblige us to defend Taiwan, but it does oblige us to provide for Taiwan's defense, which they pay for, and that we advocate for peaceful resolution of the issue, not a martial resolution of the issue.
Great. Thank you, Admiral.
Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The PRC's expansion of its military capabilities outside its borders often relies on its foreign aid loans through their Belt and Road Initiative, preying on developing nations that are strategically located in the region. This results in the construction of many dual-use facilities that provide China's Air Force and Navy with potential outstations for future operations while these recipients are left in the infamous PRC debt trap. Admiral Harris, from your perspective, how impactful are economic conditions in relation to the administration's partnership and alliance goals, particularly with regard to nations in the region that may not be as resilient to economic and military influence from China?
Senator, I believe that our policies are positive in that regard, but there's a lot more that we could do. And some of the examples I already responded to in Senator Coons' questioning. I think economically we could do a lot more in terms of free trade frameworks and free trade bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements. And China for sure is moving to fill all the voids that are all the opportunity voids that are left by us.
Well, when in the Senate Finance Committee, which I serve, the chairman serves, we have Ambassador Tai before us today. When I get to my questioning, this is going to be one of the things I'm going to ask. We don't have any free trade agreements being promoted in the region. We have a behemoth of an economic challenge with China in this region. You mentioned earlier in your testimony that people will react to their own self-interest. Countries will react into their own self-interest. That is not a novel idea, but it is a very clarion idea. So therefore, wouldn't it behoove us, for beyond an economic question, as a security concern, to be engaged in free trade agreements in this region to strengthen the economic opportunity to loosen the noose that China has with these countries?
For sure, Senator. That's why I advocated for TPP when I was the PACOM commander, because of the security angles that are represented by the countries that would sign on to TPP.
Yeah, it was a lost opportunity. Mr. Meade, do you believe a free and open Indo-Pacific is available achievable, I should say, with a foreign policy approach that's based in uncertainty?
Sorry, based in?
Uncertainty.
Well, uncertainty is irreducible in life, but I would say that the United States needs to be absolutely clear about our commitment to the region on a multidimensional basis, military, economic, cultural, in every possible way, deepening our links. Every time I've gone to the region since the 1980s, I've heard people ask me, is America here to stay? Are you really committed to this region? My answer is the first American permanent force in that area was in 1819 when we had sent the U.S. Navy to protect American whalers. I think we are here to stay, but we need to keep getting that message out. So we need to restore a sense of confidence.
And in that respect, the United States is the best deterrent our partners have in the region when it comes to Chinese aggression and expansion. Do you believe that if a future administration threatened to retreat from alliances like the trilateral alliance we have with Japan and South Korea or AUKUS, China would continue to be deterred from applying economic and military pressures against allies in the region?
I would hope that any president of the United States of any party would understand the value of these alliances and relationships, Senator.
I agree with you. And this is why I get concerned when I see what former President Trump said while he was in office, raising questions about our security alliance with Japan, refusing to say what he would do with Taiwan, even though we have a law that pretty much, I think, outlines what we should do with Taiwan. And so while I believe the Biden administration has room to improve, it's undeniable that it has reestablished the United States' position as a reliable global partner, particularly in the region that we're discussing today. And if we have uncertainty, uncertainty invites a response. And that response is not going to be the one that we want. So I hope we make it very clear and indisputable what our positions are, what our presence will be, and what our actions will be in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. Ambassador Harris, good to see you again. I so enjoyed the opportunity to visit with you when you were in Korea with a CODEL in 2019, and I'm very happy that you're here today. On the alliance question, I think sometimes those of us on this side of the dais understand some realities, but we don't explain them that well. And I'd like to get into the rapprochement that the U.S. has been able to help forge between the political leadership in South Korea and Japan. When President Biden had the summit at Camp David, the headline here at home was President Biden, has these leaders at Camp David. And it was kind of a ho-hum moment at home because we viewed Japan and South Korea as allies. So it wasn't that surprising. But I think it was a much bigger deal in Japan and South Korea. Talk a little bit about what this closer political relationship between Japan and Korea mean to stability in the region.
It means, in my opinion, Senator, and good to see you again, it means everything in the region, especially Northeast Asia. Cooperation, there is no economic or security issue that can be resolved in Northeast Asia without the active participation and cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo. Otherwise, without that cooperation, there will be no positive movement and security in the region, and China will move to fill that void. I believe that President Yoon of South Korea and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan's outreach to each other, despite considerable domestic opposition, in doing the right thing, demonstrates statesmanship in action. And the significantly improved bilateral relationship and the significantly improved trilateral relationship that's playing out now is the benefit of that. And the big beneficiary of that is stability and prosperity in Northeast Asia.
Let me ask you a question about how to calibrate the work we're doing in the region to be a deterrent to Chinese aggression without it being a provocation to China. You talked about the Davidson window, and I'd sort of like to hear each of you respond to this. I think the Davidson window concept is a concept about when China could invade, not necessarily when they will invade. So it's when they believe they have the capacity to undertake military action. And I think the U.S. strategy has been to just push that back, a day at a time, a year at a time. And we do that by providing defense support to Taiwan. We do it by creating this lattice work of alliances to promote stability in the region, whether it's AUKUS or the Quad or working with Korea and Japan. At some point, one of Xi Jinping's calculations could be, I'm not yet ready, but if I see too many pieces being put on the chessboard around me that might block my ultimate ambitions, I may act before I'm ready. And this has to be probably one of the most careful analyses done every day in the Pentagon and elsewhere in our security establishment to try to decide what is a deterrent and then what goes beyond deterrent to provocation. Could you share a little, each of you share your own thought on how we try to get that calibration, how we should contemplate calibrating this correctly?
It's a very good set of questions, Senator. I would argue that part of what we need to do is to make the picture bigger, that the consequences of a Chinese attack on Taiwan or a full-blown blockade of Taiwan would not just take place in the South China Sea. I think it would be very hard to get commercial shipping in and out of Chinese ports should there be an event of that kind. I don't know that it would be easy for South Korea to trade with the rest of the world if there is a military confrontation in the South China Sea, Japan, Taiwan, and so on. We could be doing a good deal to deter China by showing that we and other countries around the world are prepared to impose a global blockade on China that would exert severe costs. But we should also, I see that Bloomberg, I believe, his organization, has estimated that a war in the South China Sea or over Taiwan could take 10% off global GDP in a first year. A blockade could be almost as eventful. When we think about deterring and staving off and otherwise responding to this kind of threat, we really do need to put together a multidimensional approach. I think as China saw that this was a more serious element of our planning, it would the temptation to move in a Davidson window or in the scenario you described might be less.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, could I have Admiral Harris respond as well?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Senator. I'll simply say that from a military perspective, calibration is easy because the military has to be ready all the time. So they have to, assume that China's going to attack today, and so they have plans and procedures in place to deal with that. But from a diplomatic or policy level issue, it's far more difficult. And that's the heart of the question. Because like you say, you want to be supportive of our friends, allies, and partners and us, and not be provocative at the same time. But that said, I think we should be less concerned about provoking China. I mean, look what China has done to provoke us. The balloon thing last year is a case in point. That thing somehow was, if you believe China, it was innocuous and unattended. It beggars the imagination when you think about it. So we should be less concerned about provoking China than we should be concerned about bolstering our friends, allies, and partners in the region.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the witnesses.
Senator Coons asked about the importance of the support we have for the Indo-Pacific that's in the supplemental appropriation bill that is hopefully going to be considered in the House by the end of this week. Part of that, of course, the main part of that supplemental is the support for Ukraine. And it was, I think, informative that the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, in his speech before us, said, Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. So I guess my question to you is, how important is the outcome of Ukraine in regards to the calculations being made in security in the Indo-Pacific as it relates to whether Taiwan, the China Seas, or other security interests? How much are we looking at are our allies looking at what's happening, or our enemies looking at what's happening in Ukraine affecting the calculations in the Indo-Pacific? I'll go with my military person first.
A great question, and Senator, and I believe that that we must support Ukraine. And to quote Admiral Stavridis recently, it would be strategic and moral malpractice not to do so. Where Ukraine goes, Poland follows, Moldova follows, the Baltics follow. And so it's important to the stability of Ukraine, and more important to the stability of Europe and our NATO allies, that we support Ukraine. And in fact, if you look at the cost to Russia today, they have borne enormous costs in terms of material, resources, and people, and we haven't lost a single U.S. soldier in the fight. So this is Ukraine's fight, but they can't fight it without our support and the EU support and NATO support, the individual countries' support. And so that's why I believe it's so important. I do think that China, Xi Jinping, as I said before, he's no fool. He's watching Ukraine and watching it closely. And he's learning that control of the internet is vital. He's learning that he's got to be wondering if his army, which is trained in the Soviet model, is as bad as Russia's army appears to be. If the PLA Navy, People's Liberation Army Navy, is as bad as the Black Sea Fleet appears to be, and he's learning about all of these things. But to the question of how other countries in the Indo-Pacific view that, they're watching Ukraine and our actions very closely. And they'll take their cues on what we do with regard to Ukraine. And if we walk away from Ukraine, I think they will start to consider those things that we talked about earlier in the hearing, because their faith and confidence in the United States to come to their aid could be questioned. Even though we're not an ally of Ukraine, we are their allies in these countries in the Indo-Pacific, and they'll be wondering.
I think we all agree with that, with your response on that. But we're also frustrated that it's difficult for us to connect the importance of our support for Ukraine to the support of the American people for our engagement in Ukraine. So let me ask both of you a final question. Alliances, you've all pointed out, are extremely important for us to have in the Indo-Pacific. How do we explain that to Americans so that we have more support for these types of alliances among the American political system? If you give us a simple answer to that, we appreciate it, because we find that our constituents usually will lose them after one sentence. So can you give us an answer in one sentence?
Senator, I think, Mr. Chairman, I think experts and people who are deeply engaged in foreign policy often think in terms of hope and what the beautiful things that we can build. Often, it was Dean Acheson who said the average American has less than 10 minutes a week to devote to the study of foreign affairs. At a similar moment at the start of the Cold War, President Truman realized that the way to get the attention of the American people was to tell them the truth in a way that I think frightened the pants off them. That's not quite what he said, but close enough. And we need, the world situation is grave. Things could go disastrously wrong in a relatively short period of time. We need to get that message out. It needs to be done by leaders in both parties. This committee played a large role in doing that in the 1940s. We need to level with the American people about just how much trouble we're in. And I think at that point, we will begin to see a much more positive and engaged response.
Admiral?
We join alliances for us as much as for them. One sentence.
That was good.
I like it.
Senator Risch.
Thank you both. It's been, we sit here a lot, spend a lot of time here. A lot of times we get a lot of talk and not much substance. And I think today, all of us feel we got our money's worth today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Senator Kane. I've been told that Senator Van Hollen is on his way. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I don't want to hold my colleagues up. He's my colleague in Maryland, so.
Got a meeting now. Okay.
We'll give him a moment or two and see if he. I just really want to agree with Senator Risch. We were talking a little bit. The two of you are extraordinary in your wisdom, and we thank you for that. We recognize the seriousness of the situation. It's frustrating to us that we have not been able to be more effective in communicating to our constituents the urgency of these issues. And I think the point that you raised about the PRC looking at the Ukraine campaign and looking at the need to deal with the internet is a good point. We are looking at having a hearing of this committee dealing with how social media is affecting America's foreign policy and national security interests, because it's clear that our adversaries are using social media, our open system, against us. And it is affecting the type of policies that we need to deal with the urgency of the situation. I hope we're able to get the supplemental done this week, but it's already months later than it should have been. And Ukraine's paid a heavy price for our inability to act in a more timely way. So the circumstances are pretty dire, and we have not had, I really don't think the majority of Americans recognize the urgency of the situation. So any advice you have on dealing with the social media, I'll take your advice on that as well.
I'm not on social media. So, you know, I was on Twitter for a little while, but when I left Korea, I got off of that. And I just don't do social media.
I think you're right. You know, if not that long ago, Americans were bragging that our open system was going to destabilize these autocracies. And today we're concerned that these autocracies will actually use our open system, will weaponize our open system against us. That's, I think, a sign of how far the world that we are in is different from the world that we thought we were going to be in 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I look at things like the lack of education in world history in our high schools and colleges. I look at, in general, you know, a sort of lack of understanding of the history, how we got to where we are, so that young people looking at social media have no context within which to see this. We really do need to think about how do we prepare our society so that rather than being overwhelmed and divided by these new technologies and new forms of communication, they actually make us stronger.
Agreed. I've gotten information from my colleague that he will allow us to close. I don't need his permission, but he would allow us to close the hearing. The record will stay open for till the end of business tomorrow. If members have questions, we'd ask that you would answer them for the record. And again, with our sincere thanks to both of you for your help in this important subject, the committee will be adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.